What branch of the military did you serve in?
Was in the United States Marine Corps Reserve.
Why did you join the military?
I was going to be drafted.
How old were you when you joined?
21.
Where did you go to receive military training?
I went to Quantico. Went to Marine Corps OCS at Quantico, and then the Marines normally send second lieutenants to the basic school, but I was an aviation candidate. I was already pre-approved to be a pilot, and so they eliminated basic school for helicopter or for pilots, all pilots at that time. So I went straight to Pensacola, and I spent a little over a year in Pensacola, and was designated a naval aviator.
How did the training you received prepare you for your experiences in Vietnam?
It was excellent. I mean, because after I left Pensacola, I went to Camp Pendleton and was in Marine Observation Squadron 5, which became Marine Light Helicopter Squadron 267. And so I got, I think, ample training to be able to become a co-pilot when I got to Vietnam.
Please tell us about any particular incidents that occurred during basic or technical training.
Other than what a normal pilot does, some events where I tried things that I really didn't know how to do and came close to killing myself, but I learned, and I think that's how pilots learn. I remember an instructor, I asked him if he would teach me how to do an aileron roll, and he said, "That's not an authorized maneuver." So I said, "Okay." And I didn't realize, even after watching the Blue Angels, that to do an aileron roll, you need to pull the nose up 30 degrees. So I'm over the Gulf of Mexico, and I just did it level and turned it immediately into a split S. And when I woke up, I was headed to the Gulf at maximum airspeed, and fortunately it was high enough so I could pull it out. But I felt like Jonathan Livingston Seagull right before he hit the brick wall.
Please give some examples of how discipline was enforced during your training.
Well, about the third day in OCS, when we were learning how to do close order drill, and of course I was a musician and a bartender, so I didn't know anything about the military. It was totally alien to me. And a helicopter flew over. I'd never seen a military helicopter, so I looked at the helicopter, and the captain who was teaching us how to do this said, "Robinson, do you want to look at the helicopters?" And of course immediately I knew there was no correct answer, and I was really in trouble. So I said, "Yes, sir." And he said, "Good." So for 3 days I got to march 12 meters behind the platoon looking for helicopters. Had to keep my head looking straight up. And of course, there were no helicopters for 3 days. But I'd say that Marine Corps discipline is incredible. I mean, the physical discipline, the mental discipline, the academic discipline, and the commitment, which is what creates the esprit de corps. A lot of it is what makes Marines different than all the other services.
How did you feel when you learned you were going to Vietnam?
I had mixed emotions. I mean, I was trained to go to Vietnam, and I was young and immature enough to think that was what I was supposed to do. Had absolutely no comprehension of the brutality of war. I mean, even though I knew it, I didn't face that reality. And I remember sitting in my best friend's house before I went, and his father said, "Don't be too anxious. War is not what you think it is." And I recall all the enthusiasm of in Gone with the Wind, when everybody gets their uniforms and all the pomp and circumstance, until you see somebody blown up and realize the absolute horror of what war is. So I guess I had very mixed emotions in answer to your question.
What dates did you serve in Southeast Asia?
I went probably from the middle of April of 1968 to the middle of May of 1969. I was there for 13 months, except for 6 weeks when I was on the USS Tripoli. I got wounded, and I was on the boat for 6 weeks.
Where did you serve in Southeast Asia?
I served in the I Corps. I was based at Phu, which is a small city right near Hue City, the ancient capital. And so I was at Phu Air Station, or Phu Airport.
What was your rank during the war?
I was a first lieutenant. I was the first lieutenant for the whole time.
Since you served in a combat unit, please describe your first encounter with the enemy.
It was amazing, and the paradox. First of all, as I said, my background was as a musician and a bartender. So on my first combat mission, I was awakened at 3:30 in the morning, and I thought this is going to be a very long 13 months if they keep doing this. But we got up and we briefed and flew from Fubai to Marble Mountain, which is near Da Nang. And as we flew south, and the Oriental Mountains were to the right, and the South China Sea was to the left. And it was incredibly beautiful as the sun came up. And then when we got towards Da Nang, we went over the white beaches, and the beaches in the South China Sea look just like Pensacola or Destin, all along the Gulf Coast. They're beautiful white sand. And even at about 5:30 or 5:45 in the morning, people were swimming, and they had sailboats, and they were on the beach. And I thought, this is very strange. And then we landed and had actual breakfast. The base there had much better kitchen facilities than we had in Fubai. And we had a great breakfast. Then we briefed for a mission, which was an insert of troops on the Haivan Pass up in the mountains where Highway 1 left Da Nang. And we took off, and we were escorting 2 H-46 transport helicopters. And as soon as we got close to the zone, we started taking fire, and the helicopter in front of us got hit. The pilot got his leg blown off, and I was like, it was all going by me. In fact, the pilot I was with, I was the co-pilot, of course, and I had a chin turret. And so I'm firing, clicking the trigger, and then when we pulled off, he said, "Make the guns go cold," and I realized I'd never turned the guns on. So I never fired around in anger on that mission. And I was just stunned at having seen beauty and water and sea, and then have somebody get his leg blown off. It was just, I think it was a moment where I probably aged about 10 years in 1 minute.
Did you bring any personal weapons with you?
Yes, I did. I bought I thought if I'm going to go over there, I'll be a warrior. So I went to the pawn shop in Oceanside near Camp Pendleton and bought a huge Bowie knife. Now, I have no idea how to use a Bowie knife, but I thought if I'm going to go to war, I'm going to have a knife. So in fact, this knife caused my first real crash. I bought a gun belt, because when I got to Vietnam, they issued a police special 38. Every pilot had a 38, as opposed to the 45s that the infantry carried. Because the 38 had more range, and it was supposed to keep the bad guys away until you could be rescued if you went down. And so I strapped the 38 and the Bowie knife on my side, and I flew with that for a while.
Do you remember seeing any action that stood out as being particularly brave?
Oh, every day. Every single day. I mean, I saw the pilots I flew with, and then I felt like we would, as Marines, we would never leave our guys on the ground. Oh, I'm sorry.
No problem. Take as much time as you need.
Anyway, we would fly in really crummy weather and go in and cover the transports. God, I didn't think this would bother me this much.
It's your time. You take as much time as you need. This is a learning experience for everybody.
But multiple times. One that stands out is when an A4 pilot went down and was hanging in the straps in a tree. And the Viet Cong were approaching him, or maybe it was the NVA. And everybody did everything they could to get the guy out. And so I saw multiple demonstrations of bravery. So it happened every single day when people would just put themselves. And my whole squadron's job was to put ourselves between the transports and the gunfire. So every day, somebody hung it out. Yeah, I'll be all right in a second.
Want to turn this off?
Yeah.
If you were wounded while serving in Vietnam, what sort of injury did you receive? And how were you rescued and treated for your wounds?
I am the luckiest person in the world, really, because I was in a gunfight. I was in a gun run, and I was shot. A round came through the cockpit. It was an armor-piercing 30 caliber round, and it went through the instrument panel. Fortunately, hit the stick. It went through my hand, spread shrapnel everywhere, and hit me in the chest. And I was shot in the arm and the leg as well. Although I didn't know that until much later because they were just like John Wayne flesh wounds. And so co-pilot took the stick, and the crew chief dumped me backwards, and I was really all right. I just had lost a finger. And so I thought, well, first thing is I'm not going to be playing the saxophone this afternoon at the squadron picnic. My second thought is I didn't want to bleed to death, so I took my other flight glove off and wrapped it around my hand. And then I tried to make a radio call, but all my radios, my radio controls were blown out because the stick was blown up, but the top part of the stick where the radio controls were. So I had to give commands to the crew chief who could pass it on to the co-pilot. Well, we were talking to the HDC, which is the Helicopter Direction Center. Marines in our I Corps were initially if you're on land, you're under control of the DASC, the Direct Air Support Center. And when we crossed the water, and we had been working with the ship, and we were controlled by the ship, so I wanted to switch the radios to that frequency, but I couldn't because the radios didn't work. But the co-pilot had never landed on the aircraft carrier before. So I said, well, I'll take it. So I flew it back to the carrier myself, and everybody in the area switched their radios to my frequency because I couldn't switch my radios. And anyway, got back to the boat, and what was really just so touching was before I got to the boat, I had 2 transports on either side of me taking me back to the boat. Oh, God, this is really tough. So anyway, I got to the ship, and they, the corpsman met me right there, and they said, "Are you hurt anywhere else?" And I said, "No, I don't think so." And then they cut my flight suit off and found the other holes. So then I was on the operating table 20 minutes after I was hurt. So I'm really lucky. And the guy
That's
that
awesome.
worked on me was a hand and finger specialist from New York. And there isn't one on every boat. The doctor goes wherever they stick the doctor. But the guy was amazing, and he put my whole hand together. So later on, I was able to still play the saxophone. So
It's
anyway,
providential.
oh my God, yeah, really.
Providential.
Yeah.
Describe your living conditions, housing, and food while serving in Vietnam.
Well, the food on the aircraft carrier was the best food I had over there. It was incredible. I mean, and I was on the boat for 6 weeks then, and then we had a number of tours on the boat when we were getting mortared every night, we put the helicopters on an air carrier, and then we flew off another carrier. It was a World War II carrier that had been converted to a LPH, which was a helicopter carrier. It was the Valley Forge. In Phu Bai, the food was pretty awful. We had artificial peanut butter flavored ice cream, and so I don't ever eat peanut butter flavored ice cream anymore. At Marble Mountain, the food was a little bit better, and then every once in a while we had really good meals. And toward the end of my tour, they rebuilt the Officers Club, and they had pretty good food there. On a party nights, we had good food there. But what was the second part of the question? Living quarters?
Yeah.
When I first got there, I mean, I had, because we're pilots, we had much better quarters than most people. We had hardback tents in the beginning, and then probably three or 4 months after I was there, we had Quonset huts. And they built Quonset huts that were air conditioned, so it was really not that bad. Except for the rats. When you walk, if you had a real early morning brief and it was dark outside, they had Vietnamese rats that were the size of raccoons. And they had outhouses. They weren't pleasant either.
Were you aware of illegal drug use among American soldiers in Vietnam?
Not really. I never knew anybody who used drugs. I never saw it. However, first time I ever saw a marijuana cigarette was at Phu Bai, walking back with another pilot from the mess hall back to the operations desk. He said, "What's this?" And he reached down and pulled up today you'd call it a Ziploc bag, and it had a marijuana cigarette in it. But that's the only thing. Now, I later in my career, in my time there, my collateral duty was the civic action officer, the S5, and so
Cool.
I was an advisor to a village chief, and his wife made a lot of money growing marijuana. She had about 15 hectares of marijuana fields, so I know that it was over there.
Wow. What was your daily routine while in Vietnam?
Well, it varied week by week. On every fourth week, we flew SOG missions, which is Special Operating Group, and we would go to the, I forget what they call it, the SOG headquarters, and brief. And we flew where we weren't supposed to fly, where the world didn't know that we flew.
Yeah.
And
I'm
so,
familiar with SOG operations.
yeah. So we flew the prairie fire missions. And so we would get up and we would just sit and wait. And there was a lot of waiting around time. And then we would launch, and we flew with the Vietnamese helicopters. They had H-34s, and it was a combined group with the Vietnamese Air Force and the American Army and our Air Force. And we were controlled by an Air Force Covey, which is an O2. It was a Cessna, I don't know what the civilian number is, and it's a push-pull airplane. And then we had two to four Vietnamese H-34s.
Little friends.
Right. These guys, the Vietnamese pilots were amazing. They were incredible pilots. And we had two Army Slicks, which were Hueys, UH-1D models at the time. And the Army was just getting their Cobras, so we had two Army Cobras, 2 or 4 Army Cobras with us. So we had, and I flew a section of 2 Marine gunships. And at that time, I flew as a co-pilot, and then later as a pilot, and later as a section leader.
What did you do to relax?
Drank. We drank. We went to the bar. We drank, and we played volleyball, and I read a lot. Lots of books.
Please tell us about any community involvement you participated in, such as irrigation or construction projects.
Well, as a civic action officer, I worked with the village chief, and I also worked with an orphanage in Way City, and I helped rebuild things that we blew up. Actually, we rebuilt a marketplace. Very interesting. The corruption was rampant. If I needed 24 sheets of tin strips to build a roof, I had to order 96 from the federal government, because the federal government took a fourth, and regional government took a fourth, and the provincial government took a fourth, and I ended up with a fourth of it. So I knew, and the village chief I worked with was the one who taught me this. And we rebuilt a marketplace, and we built a medical facility. It was just a pavilion, but I also brought Navy doctors ashore to do MedCaps, which was medical civil action patrols, and we would go in and the doctors would treat the people. And doctors liked it because they saw things that they'd never seen and never would see again. Had people, everybody, all the people, the civilian people over there had dysentery, in various severe stages of it, because there was very little sanitation in the villages. But the orphanage actually wrote back to people in my high school and said, I need toys for TET, which was this was the second TET that I was there for. And my high school had a drive and sent back 2 truckloads of toys for these kids for TET, for the TET, the New Year time. So, and then also I had to negotiate with a farmer because we crashed a helicopter into his yard and killed his pig. And this guy was probably had some American training, because he thought that pig was worth a lot more than that pig was really worth. And so we ended up paying him a lot more than we paid him a lot for his pig.
Plenty of piastres for that one, huh?
Millions of piastres, yeah. Piastres, I haven't heard that word for a long time.
What awards or citations did you receive?
What? I'm sorry?
What awards or citations did you receive?
I have a Bronze Star with a V. I have a Purple Heart. I have a Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry. I have a Single Mission Air Medal. I have 29 Strike Flight Air Medals. I have a Meritorious Unit Citation. I have a Vietnamese Cross of Gallantry Unit Citation. I have the reserve ribbon. I have a national defense ribbon. I think that's it. Maybe more.
What is your evaluation of American military leadership and of other commanders you worked with in the field during the Vietnam War?
I ran into some really great leaders. I mean, truly great leaders. Some were majors. There was one lieutenant colonel who was a squadron commander right when I got there, and he changed to another guy who was a horrible leader, and he was an alcoholic. And I got promoted from left seat to in a helicopter. The pilot commands in the right seat, contrary to an airplane. So I got promoted from left seat to right seat, probably because I carried him home 3 times, and not because I could read maps well, although I think I could, and I think I deserved it. But I'm sure that it came early because he liked me. And our group commander was one of Pappy Boynton's black sheep, and remains to this day one of my great heroes. And he was an incredible leader and taught me things that I use in my business to this day. I thought that the wing commander, the general, was really good. I thought that the senior leadership from Westmoreland down was really inept, and they thought they could do what they couldn't do. But it doesn't even hold a candle to how dismal I thought the political situation was, that there were congressmen that sent us into war without letting us fight the war fairly. I mean, it's like having to go into a fight with one hand tied behind your back. And I had friends who bombed Hanoi, and when they were going in, they found ships with Canadian flags and French flags, and we weren't allowed to do it. And I think the evidence is, as we needed to get the North Vietnamese to the negotiating table, the way we did it was by moving the B-52s closer and closer to Hanoi. And as Nixon moved them up there, they started talking. And the other crime was the media and the left side, because if you read what General Giap said, General Giap was the North Vietnamese military commander, said that 2 more days after the Tet Offensive and they would have caved. And so I think it was a crime, just an absolute crime, on the part of the Congress and the President that we had 50,000 people killed and 700,000 wounded, without having anything to show for it.
From your experience, how would you evaluate the enemy's fighting ability?
It was incredible. I mean, absolutely incredible. They wanted to win more than we wanted to win. And later on in my career, I went to senior staff level schools and briefings from our intelligence people, and their intelligence was far greater than ours was. And if you read the book SOG by James Plaster, I don't know if you've read it, but there was a 3-star mole on the South Vietnamese Joint Chiefs of Staff. And in order to bomb anything, we had to run it through the South Vietnamese Chief of Staff, or Joint Chiefs of Staff, and the ambassador. So by the time we would send bombs out, they knew exactly where we were going. So I think that their commitment, their ability to dig tunnels, their ability to hide, their ability to capture our information was dramatic. I mean, I have all the respect in the world for the North Vietnamese and the Viet Cong and their passion. I hated their brutality, and I thought that it was, at the time, because I was 22, 24, and 25 when I was there, I thought it was a very just war. I'm not sure how I would think if I were going back today.
Could you tell me about the most memorable event that happened to you or your unit while serving in Vietnam?
Well, yeah, I mean, there's some humor here, I guess. But the initial officers' club when I got there was a tent because the bad guys had blown up the officers' club, which was just a small hut. However, we built a great big nice officers' club, and the colonel, the group commander, well, anyway, let me back up. I was medevaced for having a heart attack when I had my physical, because the EKG machine had dust in the stylus, and they got the electrodes crossed on my legs. So I was medevaced to the USS Sanctuary, where I met the head nurse and the captain of captain of the ship, the captain of the hospital on the ship. And there are 3 4-stripers on any Navy ship. One is the captain of the ship, one is the chief engineer that drives the engines, and the other is the guy who runs whatever the ship's supposed to do. And so on the hospital ship, it's the captain of the hospital. Anyway, and I asked him if I could bring some nurses ashore. And he said, sure, they'd really like to go see some Marines. They don't have anything to do on the boat. So I went to the colonel, and he said, well, as soon as the officers club, because I'm not going to let any nurses come ashore unless we have flush toilets. I said, okay. I can. So I arranged that after the officers club was built, and I went and brought 4 nurses ashore. And of course, I did some bad scheduling. I had to take them back, so I couldn't drink, I couldn't party, and I flew the mortar watch from 10 o'clock at night until midnight. So at midnight, I had to go get the girls. And of course, they were inebriated is a kind word. They were now in Marine uniforms. Their uniforms were out. They had their flight bags, but some of their underwear was hanging out of their flight bags. So I threw them in the back of my helicopter, and I took off about 1 o'clock in the morning back for the ship, and I had a hydraulic failure. Now, I had to have an escort because I had to go over enemy territory. So I had to go back and get another helicopter. Now, Ted has now taken 2 helicopters out of the war effort, right? The one that I'm flying has to be maintained in the morning, and the other one's broken. So, but by the time I got to the sanctuary, she was no longer at flight quarters. It was 3 o'clock in the morning. And I didn't realize that the captain of the ship was a Mormon who frowned on military drinking. So I had to call the ship to emergency flight quarters in order to land. So they bring everybody on the deck, and they get me down, and I drop off these 4 drunk nurses, and they go staggering across the deck with their underwear hanging out of the flight bags, and I take off and go back home. And so I had to do a number of rug dances. One for the maintenance officer of the squadron, one to the squadron commander, one to the group commander, although he covered me. And when it came down, because it went from the ship, now the captain of the ship backed me up to it, and he said it was okay, but it went to the general and back down. But I think that was probably the most memorable
You were a
positive
fortunate
event.
young man.
I mean, my career was hanging by a thread more times than I could count, and that certainly was one of them.
What song or music reminds you of your service in Vietnam?
Lots of it. The Mamas and the Papas. That's the first time I ever heard the Mamas and the Papas. And then Country Joe and the Fish. And certainly the Ballad of the Green Beret. And then we sang a lot of songs, but we had words that I don't want recorded, but we sang to, Swing Low, Sweet Chariot. It was a 707 going to carry me home. And we had a lot of songs like that.
Did you see or participate in a USO show? If so, where did the show occur and who was in it?
Well, no, I didn't see any stars in the shows. Ironically, I had auditioned before I was wounded, probably 2 months or 3 months before I was wounded. I auditioned for what was it? The Stars? Wait, no. Armed Forces Broadcasting Network was forming a band to do talent shows up and down the coast. And so I thought, one day I thought, well, gosh, I didn't play that badly. And the next day I received orders directing me to leave the Marine Corps, go to the Armed Forces Broadcasting Network, and be the director of the orchestra. And so because I had a music minor and I'd traveled with some prominent musicians over the time. And then the next day I got my finger shot off, so that was providential too. And of course, later on, a number of years later, I remember going out to lunch with my father, and he said, he was probably 85, and he said, when you were wounded, and your mother and I were really upset, and then we found out you weren't wounded that badly, and then we thought, it's probably a good thing because we didn't think you played the clarinet well enough to make a living. So I said, hey, thanks for the confidence. Probably right.
How did you feel about your experience when you left Vietnam?
Well, I was ecstatic, and I was extraordinarily ecstatic that I lived, and that most of my friends that I had, almost all of the people that I went through flight school with, had made it through alive. And so I was just thrilled, and I was just, and I was a lot older than 1 year older, I regretted all of the bad things that happened, and so I guess I had a lot of pride. I had a lot of pride in being a Marine, and of course I had a Marine's ego at the time.
Describe how you felt once you were back in the United States.
The country had changed so dramatically. It was astounding to me. I mean, the absolute best thing was miniskirts. I mean, skirts went from below the knees to as high as they could get, and I loved that. But I didn't like the fact that everybody was the drugs were rampant. Um, I didn't know how to deal with people very well because if somebody made me mad in Vietnam, I shot them, and that was not acceptable behavior. I remember sitting at the dining room table at my parents' house probably 4 or 5 days after I got back, and a car going by in the front, and the road backfired, and I dove under the table. And of course, my mother's like, "What's the matter with you?" And it was hard to explain. Um, Contrary to what other people experienced, when I came back, I landed at El Toro and went to LAX to meet. I was going to be picked up by a girlfriend who was a flight attendant for TWA, and she was late, and the people in the bar were just pro-American military people, so they just bought a string. We didn't have to buy a drink the whole day. By the time the girl came, I couldn't recognize her, and so I had a pretty good homecoming experience. But later on, as I got back to Chicago where I lived, just kept running into people that were very hostile because I was a military person. And I remember that Christmas after I got back, the minister at our church was very anti-war. And so we had a couple drinks before New Year's Eve service. And so my dad said, "Well, just wear your uniforms and sit in the front pew." So we did. And I thought that was, just trying to make a statement. But it was very, very paradoxical. This was the time, while I was gone, Martin Luther King had been killed, John Kennedy had been killed.
Mm-hmm.
There was just so much turmoil and so much unhappiness. It was really awful.
How do you feel now about your service in the war?
Well, I take great pride in the technical skill and the fact that I flew a gunship, and I was like the shotgun on a stagecoach, and I never lost a helicopter, and I never had a crew chief hurt, and other than the guy got scratched when I got shot, and I was so proud of what we accomplished at the orphanage, and also in the village, that I left Vietnam a better place than I found it. And I made so many friends that to this day, now it's 45 years later, I think, exactly 45 years later, those people are still my best friends in the whole world.
Has your view of the war changed over the years?
Well, yes. I look at our relationship with Vietnam, and I say we have a reasonably good relationship. My view of the communist government hasn't changed. It's a horrible government, and the communism is a horrible system. And the brutality, I mean, one of the, when you said memorable things that happened, and I gave you a humorous incident, but one memorable thing was having to collect rocket boxes to use as coffins for the 350 bodies one of our ground units found near our base, and we had to go help them and this was people who had been assassinated by the Viet Cong because they had been leaning toward the South Vietnamese government. So I think the reason for the war was probably very valid. The execution of the war by the military, especially at the unit level, was spectacular. The leadership, the primary leadership, was dismal. So I don't know. I have very mixed feelings about the war.
Thank you for your service, and thank you for participating in this project.
You're welcome. Sorry I lost.